Welcome to our second unit, Testing American Ideals. Thus far, we have studied the birth of the United States and some of the founding ideals, such as from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. We've also studied how, in 1787, delegates from the various states gathered in Philadelphia to alter their government by drafting a new constitution, in which they stated, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." We are now moving into the 19th century to see how these ideals will be tested. Will this grand experiment survive? Will the United States rise to meet these ideals, or will they simply be words on a page? This series of learning activities will draw particular attention to the issues of slavery and the struggles of federalism, balancing state and federal power. Though these activities will culminate in the American Civil War, we continue to struggle today with these very same issues of race and the balance of power. We continue to struggle with our ideals as we try to form a more perfect union. This first episode will focus on the period from 1787 to 1845 as the U.S. expanded to the West, dividing itself between a free North and a slave South and testing this new form of government. This map shows the United States in 1787, bordered to the east by the Atlantic Ocean, the west by the Mississippi River, the north by British Canada, and the south by Spanish Florida. The first distinction between a free North and a slave South was the Mason-Dixon line, shown here with this blue line. In the states north of the Mason-Dixon line, slavery was seldom practiced because it was uneconomical. It cost too much. Many of these northern states later came to formally prohibit slavery in their state constitutions, starting with Massachusetts. Not so in the southern states, where the geography and an economy based on large-scale agriculture made the practice of slavery more profitable. As the nation expanded westward towards the Mississippi River, questions arose about slavery. In 1787, the U.S. Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, which prohibited the practice of slavery in the Northwest Territories, which is shown right here. This did two things. It established the Ohio River as another border between a free North and a slave South. It also established the precedent that the United States Congress was empowered to regulate slavery in the territories. This precedent was to be tested time and time again over the coming decades. It didn't take long for slavery to become a contentious issue dividing the states. In fact, back in July of 1776, sensing that there was little chance of successfully navigating the issue and for the sake of national unity, all references to slavery were omitted from the Declaration of Independence. Jumping ahead to 1787, as delegates gathered in Philadelphia in what became known as the Constitutional Convention, slavery was once again a volatile topic threatening to destroy the young nation. Slavery was referred to, though not mentioned by name, only twice in the Constitution. In Article 1, Section 2, it states, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, the whole number of free persons and 3/5 of all other persons." with slaves referred to as the all other persons. And to ease the concerns held by slave states about this powerful new government, they included Article 1, Section 9, which states that the migration or importation of such persons as any state shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited prior to the year 1808. This helped assure the ratification of the new Constitution. As we moved from the late 1700s to the early 1800s, slavery had been declining, and many felt that slavery was bound to die down throughout the nation as it had in the North. However, Eli Whitney and his invention of the cotton gin dramatically changed the course of slavery's decline. The cotton gin mechanized the process of separating the seeds from the cotton boll, which had been a labor-intensive and uneconomical process. Now that cleaning cotton was so much more efficient and required less labor, there was incentive for Southern planters to clear more land and increase cotton cultivation. Cotton became king, a driving force of the Southern economy. A steady supply of cotton was also a driving force of the North's industrial economy, with more and more factories demanding more and more cotton. Looking at this chart, you can see that in 1794, when Whitney patented the cotton gin, 16,719 bales of cotton were produced. Within a decade, by 1804, production had increased more than eightfold, reaching 135,841 bales. Demand for cotton would continue to increase, and with that, the need for more land and more labor. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson was able to double the size of the United States when he orchestrated the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from Francis Napoleon. To find out what the nation had acquired, he sent Lewis and Clark to explore and report back to him. They returned in 1806, having reached the Pacific. 2 years later, in 1808, the importation of slaves was prohibited, meaning that from that point on, the slave population would have to be maintained domestically. The slave population was 1.2 million in 1810. Slavery as a political issue arose around 9 years later, in 1819, when the Missouri Territory, which is right around this area, they applied for statehood. Missouri's application was problematic for a few reasons. First, because Missouri applied as a slave state and was located above the line established by the Ohio River, would that mean that all of the Louisiana Territory would be open for slavery? Secondly, the country was evenly divided into 11 slave states and 11 free states at that time. Missouri's inclusion as a slave state would upset that balance. What was to be done about Missouri? One solution to the problem was proposed by Representative James Talmadge from New York. He proposed to prohibit the further introduction of slaves into Missouri, and that all children born into slavery in Missouri following its admission to the Union would be freed on their 25th birthday. This would eventually bring an end to slavery in the state. His amendment also continued to promote the idea that Congress had the authority to regulate slavery in the territories. Congress settled on what's become known as the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Which separated Maine from Massachusetts and brought it into the Union as a free state. Combined with Missouri's addition as a slave state, the balance between free and slave states was thus maintained. Secondly, it established what became known as the Missouri Compromise line at 36 degrees 30 inches north latitude. As the nation continued to expand westward, slavery would be bound below that line. Political tensions over slavery declined following the Missouri Compromise, and the balance between slave and free states lasted for the next 15 years. By 1830, there were over 2 million slaves in the United States. Tensions would dramatically increase in 1831, though, thanks to a publisher and a preacher. On January 1st, 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, a white Bostonian, ran off the first issue of his newspaper, The Liberator. This marked the beginning of the abolitionist movement. Unlike the anti-slavery societies that had existed since the 1790s, whose opposition to slavery was based on economics, the abolitionists opposed slavery for moral reasons. They saw slavery as a sin. Unlike their predecessors, abolitionists, primarily from the North, included both men and women, black and white. This new movement increasingly deepened the divide in the argument over slavery. Civilized folk can compromise on economic issues, not so moral ones. There's no compromise on sin. There's no middle ground. Then in August of 1831, the South was rocked by the most violent slave uprising to date, Nat Turner's Rebellion, in Southampton, Virginia. Turner was a slave and a preacher who claimed to be acting on direct instructions from God. He raised a small group of slaves and free blacks who went from plantation to plantation, killing the owners and their families and freeing the slaves. Over 50 whites were killed before the local militia was able to put down the uprising. Though the rebellion didn't last long, it had intensive repercussions throughout the South. Southerners saw a direct relationship between Nat Turner's rebellion and the abolition movement. The rebellion was blamed on outside agitators. They took positive steps to guarantee against further rebellions. Slave codes were more strictly enforced. There was a revival of white vigilante patrols to patrol neighborhoods and make sure that all was well. Every neighborhood had a cache of arms at the ready. And they made exerted efforts to keep outsiders out. Trouble will only come if these outside agitators and their ideas are allowed to make their case. Conscious efforts were made throughout the South to keep abolitionists and their ideas out of the South. And in Congress, a gag rule descended as Southern legislators sought to protect slavery against abolitionist-sponsored legislation. They would allow no abolitionist legislation to reach the floor. Tensions continued to rise in 1832 in what became known as the Nullification Crisis. The root of the crisis was a tariff bill that had been passed in 1828. A tariff is a tax placed on imports to increase its price, thus encouraging consumers to purchase the American-made product. As can be seen in the graph above, American manufacturers benefit from tariffs, and most manufacturing took place in the northern states. The tariff was viewed quite differently in the agricultural South. As this graphic shows, the Southern economy would suffer as a result of the tariff, considering that they were consumers of manufactured goods rather than producers. Additionally, industrial European nations would likely retaliate by placing their own restrictions on American imports, such as cotton. One can see what was at stake in this chart. When the tariff was passed in 1828, cotton production had reached 679,206 bales. What was production at in 1832 when the nullification crisis arose? Southern cotton producers became deeply alarmed when they learned of British threats to seek other markets from which to purchase the cotton that they needed to keep their factories running, given that the cost of American cotton had become so high. In many ways, this scared the South, as they believed that Britain's dependence on their cotton was unshakable. They also believed that northern factories were reliant on Southern cotton and determined to exert economic pressure to oppose the tariffs. John C. Calhoun, a senator from South Carolina, declared the tariff of 1828 and its more moderate successor 4 years later in 1832 to be null and void and not binding in the state or its citizens. Calhoun threatened that any attempts made by the federal government to collect such taxes in South Carolina would lead to the state's secession, meaning that they would withdraw from the United States. Calhoun argued that the 13 states had created the federal government and thus had the authority to leave if they deemed that their rights had been violated. President Andrew Jackson responded to Calhoun by arguing that the people, not the states, had created the federal government, and that no state had the right to tear apart what the people had created. He continued by stating that any attempt by state officials to hamper tax collection would lead to federal military intervention. It was a high-stakes game of chicken, with Calhoun and South Carolina asserting the rights of states to nullify federal law and to secede, and President Jackson threatening the use of military force to enforce federal law. The crisis was averted with a compromise tariff bill passed in 1833, which gradually reduced the tax rates and let both South Carolina and the federal government save face. However, the issue of secession had now been raised, as had the use of federal military force against the state. Both of these things we will see arise in 1860-1861. Between 1820 and 1846, a series of compromises had preserved the Union. The contentious issues of slavery and the balance between state and federal power had yet to be solved, however. They had merely been put off. As we will see in the next episode, they will soon burst upon the scene with a vengeance.